Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is our first session of DRSC University for the year. The presentation today is called School to Life Transition 101. A few things to let you know. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on YouTube. We have also gone ahead and muted everybody. We will allow for about 15 minutes for question and answers at the end of the session. So at that time or earlier, you can put your questions in the chat box, and you can also raise your hands at the end of the session and we can unmute you needed. Since this session is being recorded and will be available to the public, if you do have a question, please make sure you don't give any personal information out in that question and just try to make it as generic as possible. Our next session is going to be called Clients' Rights in Facilities, and that is going to be held on April the 9th, again from the 12 to 1 o'clock hour. And just to let everyone know, we are going to shut off right at 1 o'clock today, just to keep to everybody's timetable. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to today's speaker. Amanda Hess is one of the attorneys here at Disability Rights South Carolina. Amanda, I'll give it to you. Amanda.
Go. Can you hear me, Maggie?
I can hear you now.
Perfect. Sorry, y'all. I was muted. All right. If we could go to the next slide, please. And this will take you to a copy of the PowerPoint if you would like a copy of it. Okay. We're going to begin this presentation with a bit of background on Disability Rights South Carolina, in case you are not familiar with us. Our mission is to protect the legal, civil, and human rights of people with disabilities in South Carolina. We want to enable individuals to advocate for themselves. We may advocate on the individual's behalf when they have been discriminated against or denied a service to which they are entitled. We educate the public, stakeholders, and policymakers about laws that protect individuals with disabilities. We also promote policies and services that advance those rights and interests. Next slide, please. This slide provides more information about Disability Rights South Carolina, also known as DRSC. DRSC is a nonprofit providing services statewide. It is independent of agencies that provide treatment or other services to people with disabilities. DRSC is the Protection and Advocacy, also known as P&A, agency for South Carolina. As the P&A for South Carolina, DRSC is mandated by state and federal law to protect the rights of people with disabilities in South Carolina. There are 57 P&As nationwide in all states, districts, and territories. Next slide, please. In this presentation, we're going to discuss transition services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA. Then we'll talk about vocational rehabilitation and transition. We will review that life after school is different and illustrate that through discussion of post-secondary education and employment. Next slide, please. The first area we're going to cover is transition and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Next slide. The focus of transition under IDEA is preparing for life after school. This is about facilitating transition or movement from school to areas such as post-secondary or continuing education, employment, living as independently as possible, and participating in the community. Next slide. These are the transition requirements under IDEA. In South Carolina, planning begins with the first IEP in effect when a student turns 13. The student's needs will need to be assessed, transition goals will be developed, and transition services will need to be determined. Transition needs to be reviewed and updated at least annually. Each of these will be discussed on the next few slides. Next slide. As I mentioned on the previous slide, transition planning in South Carolina begins with the first IEP in effect when the student turns 13. I note this because IDEA requires this to start at age 16, so we are beginning transition earlier in South Carolina, which is a good thing. Transition planning can actually begin earlier if a student's IEP team decides it's appropriate to do so. Transition will continue until the child is no longer eligible for services under the IDEA, including earning a high school diploma or aging out of services. Aging out of services occurs when a student with an IEP is not on a high school diploma track and has reached age 21. In South Carolina, if a student turns 21 after September 1st, then the student can complete that school year. Next slide. An important aspect of transition planning is the transition assessments and evaluations. This can help inform the IEP team of the student's interests, desires, strengths, abilities, needs, and what skills need to be learned. These can be informal, like talking to the student or observing the student, and there can be formal evaluations and assessments. They should be age appropriate to the child. There are many different types of assessments based on needs. For example, for students that use picture assessments, there are transition picture assessments. Student input is very important, as well as parental input in this process. And it's okay to ask at an IEP meeting what assessments and evaluations will be done if that's not clear. Next slide. The information from the transition assessments and evaluations and other information from the IEP team and the student will be used by the IEP team to then develop post-secondary goals. Post-secondary goals are different from the student's annual IEP goals. These goals will be in the areas of training, education, employment, and independent living where appropriate. Keep in mind that these can change, and that is okay. Something I want to note is the importance of being aware of whether the student is on track to earn a high school diploma, a credential, or a school district certificate. Next slide, please. Once the post-secondary goals are determined, then the IEP team will decide the transition services that the student needs to help reach their post-secondary goals. Transition services are a coordinated set of activities to help prepare the student for life after school. They are based on the child's individualized needs and can include instruction, related services, community experiences, development of employment objectives, daily living skills, and functional vocational evaluation. Next slide. While we're discussing transition, I wanted to highlight assistive technology, also known as AT, and how this can come up during transition. Under the IDEA, an AT device is any item, piece of equipment, product system that can be obtained commercially off the shelf, customized or modified, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities. This does not include a surgically implanted medical device or replacing them. An AT service is any service that helps select, acquire, or use an AT device. Next slide. Consideration of AT devices and services should continue and occur during transition process and planning. Once transition goals and services are determined, AT devices and services should be reviewed in light of any transition needs based on the student's IEP. For instance, if a student is using a communication app, what will that look like in transition services? In addition, new needs may arise during this process. For instance, if a student is doing community work experiences, are there any AT device or service needs during those experiences? If a student plans to attend post-secondary education or pursue employment, will there be any AT needs for the IEP team to consider as part of transition planning? Is the student aware of how to address AT in those situations? If you're interested in learning more about assistive technology and students with disabilities, we have a recorded DRSC University session on this topic. Next slide. Transition is also a time when the student will be invited to the IEP meeting if transition will be discussed. This gives the student the opportunity to share their input with the IEP team and be involved in the transition process. If the student is unable to attend the IEP meeting, then the IEP team must find other ways to ensure that the student's interests and preferences are discussed and considered. Next slide. During transition, the school district can invite agencies who may provide or pay for transition services with the consent of the parent or adult student. This could be South Carolina Vocational Rehabilitation Department, South Carolina Commission for the Blind, South Carolina Department of Disabilities and Special Needs boards and eligible providers. Could be others. If the agency fails to do this, then there should be an IEP meeting to determine other ways to meet the transition objectives in the IEP. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the student may change their mind about their goals in life after school, and that is okay. All IEPs have to be reviewed at least annually, and that includes the area of transition. If there are concerns about transition, a parent or adult student can request an IEP meeting to discuss the concerns. You could ask for a facilitated IEP meeting if that would be more comfortable. You could also try talking to the special education director or coordinator about the concerns. Next slide, please. This slide reviews other dispute resolution options if there are concerns. There is an ombudsperson specific to the Office of Special Education Services in the South Carolina Department of Education. Mediation can be requested by adult students, parents, or the school district through the South Carolina Department of Education. Both parties have to agree to hold mediation. A state complaint to the South Carolina Department of Education, which has a 1-year time frame. The most formal option is requesting due process hearing, which has a 2-year time frame to file. This could be from when the parent should have known about the problem raised in the due process complaint. The South Carolina Department of Education Office of Special Education Services has a dispute resolution website that goes into detail about all of these and has forms if you want to use them. The website address is on this slide. Next slide, please. There are some online transition resources on this slide. On the DRSC Education Resources website, there is a section on transition to adulthood with transition-specific resources. Next slide, please. Now we are going to discuss vocational rehabilitation services and transition age students. Next slide, please. Vocational rehabilitation, also known as VR, is separate from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Each state has a VR program. Vocational rehabilitation assists eligible individuals with disabilities to prepare for, find, advance, and keep a job. We are talking about VR in this presentation because it can help transition age students. Next slide. In South Carolina, there are 2 VR agencies. Not all states are set up this way. Many states have one general VR agency. However, some states have decided to have a separate VR agency for individuals who meet visual eligibility requirements. This is what South Carolina has done. The general VR agency for individuals with disabilities is the South Carolina Vocational Rehabilitation Department. The South Carolina Commission for the Blind serves individuals who are blind and visually impaired. Each agency has a main office and then local offices that serve different parts of South Carolina. You can look up your local office on their website. This slide provides the website links for their transition pages. Next slide. There are VR services that can help students with disabilities prepare for life after high school. They are pre-employment transition services, and a student can apply for direct services to receive transition and other needed VR services. On this slide, we are going to discuss pre-employment transition services, also known as pre-ETS. Pre-ETS can apply to all students with disabilities ages 13 to 21 enrolled in school, post-secondary education, or a recognized education program. Pre-ETS do not require a student to apply for VR services or have an active case with VR. These are not long-term services. These services can help a student find a career of interest and learn skills to help achieve work goals and prepare for life after school. A student can request these services, or they may be approached about these services. They may be provided by a VR agency, or the VR agency may have an agreement for another entity to provide them. Next slide, please. Pre-ETS services can be job exploration counseling. This can include exploring careers that interest the student. Work-based learning experiences. This could include job site visits, internships, and work experiences. This could occur at school or in the community. Students can learn and practice skills relevant to the workplace. Counseling on post-secondary education opportunities. This could be learning about educational opportunities after school and other relevant skills to pursue post-secondary education, like requesting accommodations when needed. Workplace readiness training. This can help develop social skills and independent living. This could encompass a number of skills to help the student prepare for work and independence. Self-advocacy training. These skills can include learning about rights and helping a student recognize what disability-related needs they may have in employment and how to address them if needed. A student does not need to receive all 5 services. You can ask your local VR office if you have any questions about VR services. Next slide. Now we are going to talk about VR transition services. Transition services are one type of VR service that can be provided to students and youth with disabilities that have been determined eligible for vocational rehabilitation services. a student will need to apply to the VR agency for eligibility. If found eligible, the VR agency will develop an individualized plan for employment, also known as an IPE. The IPE will contain the student's employment goal and the services the student needs to help reach that goal, which can include transition services. This plan has to be reviewed at least annually and can change with the student. VR may attend IEP meetings. VR services help the student or youth with a disability transition into life after school, which can include post-secondary training to achieve a work goal, competitive integrated employment, work training, and supported employment. These services are based on the student's needs, preferences, and interests. Transition services are a type of VR service that can include instruction, community experiences, employment objectives, and other adult living goals after school. This can provide the student with more in-depth, individualized services to assist in the transition from school to post-secondary education and/or to employment. Keep in mind that VR can continue helping a student when needed after high school ends. So having an IPE in place before exiting high school is an important consideration. This can ensure a smooth transition process and not delay a student towards achieving their work goals. Next slide, please. If there is a concern with VR services, you could speak with a VR counselor, speak with the counselor's supervisor, contact the VR ombudsperson, contact the Client Assistance Program, also known as CAP, at Disability Rights, South Carolina. Next slide, please. Here are some VR resources. The first is to DRSC's Pre-Employment and Transition Services webpage. There are also links to a guide and guidance on transition services that include VR. We also have a DRSC University recorded session on Transition Services 101, the role of vocational rehabilitation in the transition process. Next slide, please. Why is transition so important? Transition is so important because this is an opportunity to prepare for life after school and learn needed skills. Life after school is very different. For instance, students with IEPs who move on to post-secondary education and/or work will not receive accommodations the way they were determined in public school. Students need to be aware of these changes and how to obtain support for their disabilities when needed in both work and post-secondary education. Transition is a time when this can be done. Next slide, please. We are now going to discuss post-secondary education and reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, also known as Section 504. Next slide, please. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law made up of titles. Title II and Title III of the ADA prohibit discrimination based on disability. Title II of the ADA applies to state-funded schools, such as state universities, community colleges, and vocational schools. Title III of the ADA applies to private colleges, universities, and other private post-secondary schools. This does not apply to religious entities, such as a post-secondary entity run or controlled by a religious organization. Next slide. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination against a qualified individual with a disability by programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. Any post-secondary schools that receive federal funding are covered under Section 504. Next slide, please. Let's review some of the differences between high school versus post-secondary education. These are things to be thinking about and planning for before post-secondary education starts. In high school, the school district has a responsibility to identify students with disabilities. The school district must evaluate the student, and parents are usually the decision makers. In post-secondary education, students must self-identify if accommodations are needed. Students may need to provide documentation of their disability, and students are the decision makers. Next slide. Most post-secondary schools have offices to help students with disabilities. They could be named something like Disability Support Services, Center for Disability Services, Office of Student Disability Services, or something similar. You can usually find this on the school's website. You could also ask about this during the admissions process. If a student needs an accommodation or modification, which are also known as academic adjustments, the student will need to request it from the school. The student may need to provide reasonable documentation of the disability and of the need for the accommodation or modification if needed. The student is responsible for paying for any evaluations needed in relation to the documentation requested. Next slide, please. Reasonable accommodations can be requested at any time, but the earlier the better if the student is aware of the need. This may start an interactive process, which is generally a discussion about the need for academic adjustments. The school's procedures should be followed to make the request. Let the school district know as soon as possible if the accommodation isn't working. Next slide. Here are some examples of accommodations and modifications. Sign language interpreter, extended time on tests, early enrollment, accessible handouts, preferential seating, service animals, note takers. Next slide, please. Keep in mind that post-secondary schools are not required to fundamentally alter the nature of the program, which is a change in the program's essential nature, or create an undue burden, which is significant difficulty or expense. In these instances, the school must try to find an alternate accommodation. Next slide. Here are some ways that concerns could be addressed. Contact the school's Disability Support Services Office or the ADA/504 coordinator. File a grievance with the school. File a complaint with the appropriate federal agency. File a lawsuit in court. Next slide, please. Let's connect this back to transition. Here are some transition tips for post-secondary education while the child is in school. Meet with your child's high school counselor. Discuss post-secondary education desires with the IEP team. Research schools, degree programs that your child is interested in. Teach self-advocacy skills. Is your child knowledgeable about their disability and needs that may arise in post-secondary education? Is this a skill to work on? Become familiar with Post-Secondary Disability Services Office and practice requesting reasonable accommodations. Next slide, please. There are post-secondary education resources on this slide. Next slide, please. The final area we are going to discuss in this presentation is employment and reasonable accommodations under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide, please. The general rule of Title I of the ADA is qualified individuals with disabilities cannot be discriminated against because of ability in the job application process, hiring, promotions, terminations, training, and other employment terms, conditions, and privileges, such as the bathrooms, training, employer-sponsored events. Next slide. Under Title I, an employer is generally an employer with 15 or more employees. I mentioned qualified individual with a disability on the previous slide. Under Title I, a qualified individual with a disability is an applicant or employee who can perform the essential job functions with or without a reasonable accommodation and has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. I'm going to give examples of major life activities on the next slide. There are other ways an individual can have a disability under Title I, but I am just focusing on actual disability in this presentation. Next slide, please. Some examples of major life activities are seeing, standing, walking, reading, breathing, performing manual tasks, learning, hearing, bending, eating, caring for oneself, thinking, concentrating, communicating. This also includes major bodily functions, such as immune system, bladder, respiratory, normal cell growth, neurological, circulatory, bowel, bladder, brain. These are just examples. There can be many others. Next slide, please. What if an applicant or employee with a disability is facing a workplace barrier due to disability in the application process, performing their job, assessing a privilege or benefit of a job, just like other employees? The applicant or employee can request a reasonable accommodation from the employer. Accommodations are not automatically provided by the employer. This is a huge change from IEPs. Next slide, please. A reasonable accommodation is an adjustment or modification that enables the applicant or employee with a disability to apply for a job, perform the essential functions of their job, which is their job duties, enjoy the benefits and privileges of their job like their coworkers, for example, training and social events. This can include making facilities accessible. Next slide. Here are some reasonable accommodation examples: job restructuring, altering work schedules, reassignment to a vacant job, assistive technology, interpreters, adjusting or modifying policies, accessible worksite, service animals, accessible exams, and training materials. Next slide, please. Some things that are not reasonable accommodations are eliminating an essential job function, lowering production or performance standards, and personal use items used on and off the job. For example, hearing aids or a wheelchair. Next slide, please. An employer doesn't have to provide a reasonable accommodation if it can prove it would result in an undue hardship on the business. An undue hardship is significant difficulty or expense. This should be based on an individualized assessment, and there are factors an employer should review. An employer cannot deny a reasonable accommodation just because there are costs. Next slide. A reasonable accommodation can be requested at any time. It can come from the applicant, employee, or another person. There is no exact language to request a reasonable accommodation. The employer needs to be told that an adjustment or change is needed because of their disability. The request does not need to be in writing, but we suggest that it is and that you keep a copy for your records. There is a link to a sample request letter from the Job Accommodation Network, also known as JAN, website on this slide. Next slide, please. Once the request is made, the employer should engage in an interactive process. This is an informal process to clarify needs and identify a reasonable accommodation. The employer may request more information about the disability if it is not obvious. This is limited to documentation that establishes the disability and the need for the accommodation. Next slide, please. An employer is prohibited from retaliating against a job applicant or an employee for requesting a reasonable accommodation. An employer is also prohibited from coercing, intimidating, threatening, or interfering with an applicant or employee who has requested a reasonable accommodation. Next slide, please. Here are some ways concerns can be addressed. Try talking to human resources. If a job applicant or employee feels they have been discriminated against, they have to exhaust administrative remedies before a lawsuit can be filed. This means go through an administrative process. A charge of discrimination can be filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, also known as EEOC, or the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission, also known as SCHAC, SCHAC. Website links to both of these agencies are on this slide. There is 180 days to file a charge, but it is extended up to 300 days to do this in South Carolina. Next slide, please. Earlier in this presentation, I discussed vocational rehabilitation services regarding transition. I want to remind you that VR services can assist eligible individuals with disabilities with preparing for, finding, advancing, and/or maintaining work. There are various individualized services, such as assistive technology evaluations, an AT for work, or having a sign language interpreter for job interviews. This can take place in life after school. We have a DRSC University recorded session on vocational rehabilitation 101 if you are interested in learning more about VR. Next slide, please. Let's connect employment back to transition. Here are some transition tips to prepare for employment. A vocational assessment. determining any needed assistive technology, involving South Carolina Vocational Rehabilitation Department or the South Carolina Commission for the Blind in transition planning at IEP meetings, having community experiences and exploring types of work during transition, working on resume and interviewing skills, learning self-advocacy skills, becoming knowledgeable about your disability and appropriate times to disclose if needed, becoming familiar with accommodations and practice requesting reasonable accommodations. Next slide, please. This slide provides some employment resources. The Job Accommodation Network is a very helpful website that contains many resources and also has many ideas for reasonable accommodations. There are also links to information on the EEOC and the SHAC, SCHAC websites. Next slide, please. This slide contains the contact information for Disability Rights South Carolina, including the helpline and our general email. This can be used if you are seeking assistance from DRSC. We have many resources and more information about DRSC on our website, which is listed on this slide. You can also find recorded DRSC University sessions on this website. Next slide, please. Thank you for attending this session. This presentation provides general information not intended to be legal advice. The information was based on law and guidance at the time it was written. As this may change, please contact DRSC for updates. The views expressed in this presentation are solely those of DRSC. This presentation is partially funded through a Social Security Administration SSA grant agreement. Although SSA reviewed this document for accuracy, it does not constitute an official SSA communication. This presentation was developed at U.S. taxpayer expense.